everyone, thanks so much for coming out tonight here in Burlington. Some people might be coming in a little bit later, which is totally okay. They can just come in the back. You don't have to direct them up to the front to grab their starters, because I know that you all did. But for being on time, those starters are going to be important. For at the very end, we're going to have a raffle for this dough whisk that I have up here that is related to your sourdough starter that you already grabbed. So thanks so much for having me here at the library, and thanks to Daphne, who's outside right now, signing people in, for helping to set up the event, and for the Burlington Access TV to have me here and recording the event. My name is Brandon, or Sourdough Brandon, as you can tell from the logo and a lot of these materials that some of them my mom made for me, which is nice. I do this workshop all over the state, though, teaching people how to bake and make sourdough bread and other things, but this is kind of the foundational course that's all about how to make, maintain, and store a sourdough starter, which is the foundation of all sourdough baking. And so that's what this 1 hour presentation is all going to go into about. So first, just a little bit about myself. So I live out in western Massachusetts in Granville, which is one of the small hill towns, kind of near Springfield and Westfield area. And I'm a full-time sourdough food blogger, so I have a website, sourdoughbrandon.com, where I put all of my recipes, guides, and tips on that website. And the mantra for my website is to help homemakers to succeed, because I'm a homemaker myself. So I do everything in my own home kitchen. So all the photographs that you see, everything that I'm writing, and even social media videos that you see are all in my home kitchen. And these sourdough starters came from my own home kitchen. So I know how much of a process sourdough baking can be, and that it can be maybe a little bit mystical to some people. And so I'm hopefully, having as much instructions and detailed instructions and guides on my website with photos and everything to help you along in the process and maybe help demystify some of that process, because I know that it can be a little bit intimidating just to even get started. But the sourdough starter, this workshop is all about kind of just even getting started with that process and to help homemakers succeed. And so a lot of this information is on my website that you're going to see in this presentation, but it does go the full hour. I have a sourdough starter recipe that walks through exactly how to make, maintain the sourdough starter, and then a lot of this information is on various guides and instructions on the website in various places. So this is what we're going to be going over throughout this overview. But like I said, it is going to go the full hour, so I do have time at the very end for questions, and so I want to make sure that we get to everything. So I'll save room for questions at the end, so if something comes up, just raise your hand at the very end or write it down, so we'll make sure that I get to that. So we're going to talk about exactly what is a sourdough starter, what can you make with your sourdough starter, so you can make more than just breads if you didn't know with your starter, why are people interested in sourdough baking, why am I passionate about it, and why do I share this out with you all, and then we're going to do this day-by-day walkthrough of how to make a sourdough starter from scratch. But luckily I've already done the hard process of that for you all, because you're going to be leaving with active live culture. It's hungry, it's ready to be fed, and so we're going to talk you through how I made this, so then you could go home and make a brand new one for yourself, or if you wanted to make a different type of starter with a different flavor, and we'll do that day-by-day walkthrough with some of the instructions or some of the ingredients and some of the tools that I use to do that process. And then we'll talk about how to maintain and adjust the feedings. So you may have heard that having a sourdough starter is like having a pet, so it doesn't have to be like that unless you want it to be. And so we'll talk about how you can learn to store your starter in various ways so you don't have to feed it every single day like I do. We'll talk about something called sourdough discard, which is just a part of the process of feeding your sourdough starter. So it's just something that's a natural process, or part of the process. And then we'll talk about how to store the starter, and then I have some helpful tools up here that I like to use, and we'll have that Q&A at the end, followed by the raffle. So first, what is a sourdough starter? So here is a time lapse of over the course of 4 or 5 hours of my sourdough starter over doubling in size. And I put this rubber band here, that is the level where I fed it at with flour and water, and you can see it over doubled in size, and it looks very bubbly and gaseous, and it looks very much alive. And that's because it is. A sourdough starter is a symbiotic culture of bacteria and wild yeast that is strong enough to leaven bread. And these wild yeast you are trapping in a jar or a container, and it is strong enough to leaven bread. And these are yeast that exist in the flour that we use to feed it, as food for the sourdough starter, on our hands, in the air around us, and the water that we use to feed it. It's just a natural wild yeast that exists everywhere all around us that we're trapping into this jar, essentially. And this is the main way that bread was made until the development of fast-acting yeast that scientists extracted from sourdough and other wild yeast. They extracted these monocultures that could leaven bread very, very quickly. And so when you buy instant yeast, or those granule powders of yeast that you buy at the store in packets, that is the monocultures of yeast that you are making. Anyways, so this is the main way that bread was made for thousands of years until scientists extracted, these strongest forms of yeast, these monocultures of yeast that they extracted for soldiers in the battlefield to leaven bread very, very quickly. And so that's what most bakers use, most bakeries use, and also when you go to the store and you buy those instant granule yeast packets, that's what you're using to leaven bread very, very quickly. But before that, it was sourdough for the most part. But at its very core, basic level, it's really just flour and water left over time to ferment. That's all a sourdough starter is. You don't need grapes or vinegar or yogurt or any other special ingredients, only flour and water. And if you're a little bit more scientifically minded, or if you're wanting to know exactly a little bit more about the process, it's a fermentation process. And so the yeast, these wild yeast that exist everywhere and in the food, are consuming carbohydrates as food in the flour, and then there's various byproducts in this fermentation process. And there's a couple of them, and the main one is CO2, so carbon dioxide. So that's contributing to the leavening power of the bread. So when you see the bubbles here, and the way it's rising, that is the CO2 or the carbon dioxide. And also when you slice into a loaf of nice sourdough bread and it has the holes in it, that's the CO2 that has trapped all of the gas that has trapped all of the gluten structure, so that's why you're seeing those holes in like a typical sourdough bread. And then lactic acid is another main byproduct that is contributing to the flavor and the preservation of the bread. So that acidity or the complexity or the sourness that you may associate with a sourdough bread is from the lactic acid. And there's other byproducts as well, but those are kind of the main two ones in the process. And I'll just say that every starter is a little bit different based on location and based on the way you're feeding it and so many other different factors. And so if you're familiar with sourdough baking, San Francisco and the Bay Area in California is known for their sourdough starters and sourdough breads. And if you buy sourdough starter online on like Etsy or something, a lot of times people will be selling like a specialty San Francisco starter. And so they say that their starter is the best and that their bread is the best. And really that's a little bit there's truth in that because there are specific yeast that exist only in the Bay Area, but it's really because they built a bread culture there that is just the norm of like baking with sourdough, and that's based on the history of people in the Oregon Trail taking their sourdough starters on the Oregon Trail, ending up in California, and then this bread culture kind of started there. But you can make really great sourdough bread wherever you are in the world, including here in Burlington or in Granville where I am, and you can have it taste more or less sour depending where you are. And so why am I interested in sourdough baking? Why might you be here? I have a long list of reasons why, and I would say that my reasonings kind of are a little mix of all of these different things. And one is that it can last forever with proper maintenance and storage. People have heirloom starters that they pass down for generations, and they've even found like ancient dried sourdough starter in ancient Egyptian tombs that they tried to revive, which I don't know if you would eat that bread, but I totally would. So yeah, it can last forever with proper maintenance and storage, and people have these starters that they sell, or you'll see them online that people sell that are like hundreds of years old, which I don't know how they prove that, but it's a great heirloom to have to pass down throughout your family. And I'll just say, when you're baking your own sourdough bread, I think it's just that aroma, the smell, or the taste of like freshly made bread. It's really hard to go back to store-bought bread when you start making your own bread, even though I buy my own store-bought bread for convenience sometimes. But along with that, we take it for granted buying sliced bread at the store, and I think it's really nice and convenient to have such a staple product that's easy to access for most people here. But I think knowing how to make your own bread, having this life skill is just something that for any age is a really great hobby or experiment to have. And sometimes there's parents or kids that come into the workshops, and I'm kind of like, maybe instead of starting with like a cat or a dog as a chore to feed as a pet, maybe you start your sourdough starter as the hobby or the chore, because it's like, if you don't feed the sourdough starter, it's not that big a deal, but if you don't feed the dog or the cat, that could be chaos or anything. There's longer shelf life with a sourdough starter or with sourdough breads. It's a great way to kind of connect with traditional bread making practices. As I said, people have been doing this forever. And some claim various health benefits like easier digestion due to the long fermentation of the grains. You can bake with whole grains and ancient grains for even more health and nutrition. And that way it has a lower glycemic index, sourdough breads do, so it doesn't spike your blood sugar levels as quickly. And some with gluten intolerances are able to consume sourdough bread even. And I would say, if you enjoy being in the kitchen, if you like baking, if you like, being a home cook and making your own things from home, this is maybe a better baker and a better home cook overall. So I think it's a really great way to kind of get active in the kitchen and get your hands in the dough and kind of slow down in this meditative process to start making your own breads. And so I've been talking a lot about breads already, and I have an image here of like one loaf that I made that this is kind of the traditional kind of look of what you think of when you see a sourdough bread with those, custardy kind of crumb that's soft in the middle, with the big open interior, open crumb we call it, or this like crunchy outside exterior crust with a little flap open even. That's like kind of your typical look of what a sourdough bread might look like. But there's so much more even in the sourdough bread kind of world that I kind of want to move away from. When you think of sourdough, we think of breads, we think of a specific flavor, and it really doesn't have to be either of those things. And sourdough is more of a process than it is a specific type of bread, and some people may call it naturally leavened baked goods. So you may see bakeries or other people selling breads, and they may, instead of saying sourdough, they may say naturally leavened, because it also doesn't have to denote a certain sour flavor. And a lot of times when you go to a bakery, you buy sourdough breads, they've added citric acid to give it that sour flavor, when that's not a typical ingredient that you find in most sourdough breads. And you can learn to adjust the sourness levels of your bread based on the fermentation process. So really, it's naturally leavened. Sourdough is more of a process, so it's a little bit of a misnomer that we call it that, but it can be sour if you want it to be. And in that bread category, there's so many different types of breads that you can make. So think of things like challah or babka or bagels, or just so many different types of breads, whole grain breads, whole wheat breads. You could use ancient grains, all kinds of different styles, baguettes, and then even inclusions into your bread. So some recipes on my website that are popular, some sourdough breads that I have one that tastes like pizza, and it has like sun-dried tomato and oregano and red pepper flakes in it and capers. It's so delicious, and that's maybe not something that you maybe expect to put into your breads, but you could do something like roasted garlic or jalapeno and cheddar, whatever you want to do and put into your breads as well. Or you can make something soft and fluffy like these brioche rolls that I make. So even outside the bread category, you have any other leavened baked goods that you can use your sourdough starter in. So where you would usually use like an instant packet of yeast, you could use sourdough starter in place in those types of recipes. So even sweet things like cinnamon rolls, this is a recipe that I have on my website. They're soft, they're pull-apart texture, brioche, buttery dough. The dinner rolls I mentioned are popular at Thanksgiving and the holidays. And then even something like croissants are leavened typically with a packet of yeast. You can use sourdough to make sourdough croissants, which I have a recipe for on my website as well. So many different things that you can make with your sourdough starter beyond just breads. And then, even outside of leavened baked goods, you can actually use your sourdough discard, which is part of the feeding process of your starter, as a flavor enhancer in quick-acting recipes. So thinking of things like cookies and pancakes and banana bread, these recipes have mechanical leaveners, such as baking powder, baking soda in them, or maybe some type of egg or something. And the sourdough discard is acting as a flavor enhancer to give it a little bit of that sourdough tang in these recipes, but they come together in less than an hour typically. And so they're fast-acting recipes, and the sourdough starter is not fermenting anything in the process typically. Sometimes there might be an overnight fermentation if you want to, but that way there's no waste involved in feeding your sourdough starter. And I'll talk a little bit more about exactly what that is. So you can use your sourdough starter in so many different things, even just beyond breads. And so the tools that you need to make and maintain your starter are pretty basic and simple, but the first one may be intimidating for some people because they've never baked this way, but it's probably the most important tool that I have on every single one of my recipes, I think, just because, one, most sourdough bakers and books, and maybe books that you even check out here at the library, will be writing their recipes in weight. And so having a baking scale is really important for the sourdough process because it helps you be more accurate, consistent, and better replicate a recipe. And that's because everyone measures all of these ingredients very differently. And on a small scale, 1 cup of flour off 10, 20 grams, not a big deal on a small recipe. So if you're making something like a banana bread or a cookie or something that doesn't have that much flour in it, it may not be that big of a deal. But for a sourdough bread that has many cups of flour in it, if every one of us measured a cup of flour in here, it would come out quite differently. And that's because those are volume measurements, and volume measurements are actually the standard cups that you buy at the store aren't actually standard from brand to brand, and everyone measures the ingredients differently. So some people scoop and level, some people sift their flour, some people fluff it up, some people condense their flour in a cup of flour. And so even on a small scale, it may not be that big a deal. A sourdough recipe that has multiple cups in it, it becomes an exponential issue, and now you've added an extra cup of flour to your recipe or not enough flour to your recipe. And that's just talking about flour. Sourdough starter always different from person to person based on so many different factors, how active it is or not. And so that's why if you start measuring your ingredients by weight, it will become a lot more consistent. And so this one is an Ascali scale that I have links for this stuff on my website. But this one is about $20 or $25, I think, on Amazon. You can get this at other local grocery stores. Other places often have a baking scale as well, or any type of kitchen scale that measures weight in grams is typically what you're looking for. I also think it's cleaner to measure by weight as well, because you can just set a bowl on top of your scale, tear it to 0, and then dump all of your ingredients into that one bowl instead of like having to get all of your measuring cups out and cleaning all of those and your tablespoons and teaspoons and all of that. So it's a lot easier when you just have a dough, you put it into your bowl, and you dump all of your ingredients into that, I think, as well. But the next two things, you probably have some version of these at home, and so I have some of my favorites up here. So some type of glass jar. So I like glass because it's non-porous and it's easy to clean, it's dishwasher safe. And I like glass jars that have wide lids, so you're able to easily pour your ingredients into the jar, stir everything together, and ones that have flat bottoms and flat sides, just so all the flour can really get hydrated in the jar. So you could use something like a mason jar. You could use an old jam jar that you have. One time I used an old pickle jar, but then my starters smell like pickles, so I don't recommend that. But any type of jar that you have is going to work for the most part. But I really like these jars. They're called Weck jars, W-E-C-K. I typically buy these on their website. It's actually cheaper than on other places, so I just buy it on like Weck.com. I think is their weckcanningjar.com. And they come with a seal, typically, the way that they're sold, so they're canning jars. And I take this seal off when I put my sourdough starter in here, because carbon dioxide is being produced in like any fermentation. Say if you were making your own beer at home, wine, or other kombucha or something like that, the carbon dioxide that's being produced can pop the lid off when you're making things like that. And the same thing goes for your sourdough starter. So some of these may even be slightly domed on top due to the fermentation. This is a really tight lid on these right now, so that pressure is building and the lids can pop off. So that's why I recommend taking the canning seals off and just using like a glass lid or whatever, in these types of jars it's a glass lid, and just resting it gently on top of your jar. But if you don't have the perfect lid, you could use a cloth. You could use a coffee filter with a rubber band, that would work. This jar is sold with a cloth that you can use, but you want to keep gnats or fruit flies out of it, especially during the summertime when it's hotter and humid. They're kind of attracted to the scent and the acidity and the sourness of the starter. You can use a mason jar. If you do use one, I recommend not using the aluminum lids like this one, because the aluminum will start to react with the pH acidity of the starter, and it will start to rust over time, so you can't use it a can with. So I recommend getting like the plastic reusable lids for those if you end up using one. And then lastly is some sort of small spatula. I like silicone small spatulas because you can just buy like packs of these online, and they're just easy to scoop and scrape your starter jar. I typically, the starter jar will start to get a little gunky or kind of dried up on the top, so I typically clean the jar out every week or two and move the starter to another jar, so I like to have a couple of jars. And these really help get into the jar when they're really small and just like stir everything together, because your starter is kind of pancake batter-ish consistency, or cake or muffin batter, if you will. So it's kind of that thick batter consistency, and you just want to make sure you can get in there, scrape the sides, and hydrate the flour really well. You can definitely use a stainless steel spoon, like a kitchen spoon as well, if that's all you have. So you don't have to have a silicone spatula. And then I mentioned, the ingredients that you need for a starter is just flour and water, and that's all I use to make a starter and to maintain my starter. But I get into a little bit more specifics here of the types of flours that I like, and I have a couple of brands here that I like to use as well that you can typically find at most grocery stores. So first is bread flour. So I like to feed my starter bread flour because I'm making breads the most often. If you are making cakes or sweets or other things that use all-purpose flour most of the time, then I would recommend feeding all-purpose flour. So yes, you can feed your starter all-purpose flour or any type of wheat flour that you have around. If you're making whole wheat breads the most, then feed it whole wheat flours. If you're making rye breads the most, feed it rye flour. If you're looking for a gluten-free starter, this is not a gluten-free starter, so this is a wheat starter. It will only kind of work with glutinous flours, so wheat flours. So if you're looking to make a gluten-free starter, I would recommend following the instructions that I'll go through next on how to make a starter from scratch, but use a gluten-free flour, because you can make a gluten-free starter from scratch the exact same way, but you'll just need to use a gluten-free flour like Cup for Cup, Measure for Measure are popular brands, or you can use something like sorghum, rice flour, or buckwheat flour. So those are other ones that people use for gluten-free starters. And you can also buy gluten-free starters online if you're interested in that process. So this is a wheat starter. If you fed it gluten-free flour, it would rise, but it technically wouldn't be a gluten-free starter because there's still some wheat in that starter there. So I prefer organic or unbleached because the nutrients haven't been stripped through that process. And so there's like lots more minerals and soluble sugars for your starter and wild yeast to consume. And like I said, I'm making bread flours the most. It has higher protein, higher gluten content, so the starter just likes to eat that. And I like having my starter kind of adjusted to the flours that I'm going to be feeding and baking with the most. So a couple of bread flours I have up here is King Arthur bread flour. So they're in their popular blue bag. This is just the unbleached regular version. They have an organic option of this, and you can find it in most grocery stores here in the Northeast because they're based in Vermont. So they're a really great company. They're owned by the employees. They're a B corporation. And they even have like a 24/7 baker's hotline number that you can call, which I've never called, but you could call it if you ever had a question. They have sourdough recipes and other things on their website as well. So they're really great, from bag to bag of flour is very consistent. It's kind of the highest quality flour that you can get in most grocery stores in the United States, and that's why I recipe test with it and bake with it because it's very consistent. But a local option, they're starting to expand a little bit more, especially out in Western Mass, is ground up grain, which I have here. And they have a stone mill out in Holyoke, and they use the hydropower there to mill their flours and other grains. So they have a bread flour option here that acts a little bit more like a whole wheat bread flour. So that's a really great option if you ever see that out. They're definitely expanding a little bit more. I know they're in co-ops out in Western Mass, and there's some other ones in Massachusetts as well. So if you can find like local flours and local mills, that's really great to have local flours as well.
Sorry, can you tell the name of that brand again?
Yeah, it's ground up grain is that option as well. Another one might be like Bob's Red Mill, which I have their rye flour here, which I'll talk about in a second. So that's another one that you can find even in like Ocean State Job Lot, and that's another like high quality flour, just kind of like King Arthur here. And then when I make a sourdough starter from scratch, so you already have active live culture, you don't have to do this. But when I like to make one from scratch, I feed it a little bit of rye flour because rye flour is like a kickstart, vitamin booster, enhancer for your sourdough starter. And if your starter is ever sluggish, if it's been in the back of the refrigerator for months and you haven't fed it, but it's still alive, hopefully, if you feed it a little bit of rye flour, it'll really help kickstart the process because it has all of these extra minerals and soluble sugars and nutrients that your sourdough yeast are just going to love to eat. And so when you're making a brand new starter from scratch, if you've ever had an issue before, if you keep it in a warm environment and feed it rye flour, like it will really help expedite the process. And so I really like using rye flour to start a starter from scratch or bring one kind of back to health as well. And then however you drink your water is how I would feed your starter. So I typically use, I do use my well water because it's been tested and it's clean and safe. Where I am, but however you drink your water is how I would feed the starter. So if you use tap water, that's okay. If it's highly chlorinated and you typically filter it, then I would filter it and feed your starter that way. I usually use room temperature or slightly warm water. You don't want it to be too hot or it can kill the starter, but too cold will just kind of make it a little bit slow and sluggish because we'll talk about temperature and what that does to the fermentation process. So room temperature, however you drink your water is kind of the best, I think, for most people. So once again, you're leaving with active live culture. It is ready to be fed. And so I'm going to go through this process of making a sourdough starter from scratch day by day. But you don't have to do this because you get to be lazy here today. I've already done this part of the process for you. So it can take a week or a couple of weeks to get a brand new starter going from scratch. So I've already done this part of the process for you. But I want you to know how I went through this. So if you wanted to make one from home, if you wanted to make a brand new starter with a different type of flour or like a gluten-free flour like I talked about, and so you feel empowered to do that with in case something ever happened to your starter, so you know how to do that at home. All right, so the first day of making a brand new starter from scratch, I mix that equal parts bread flour and rye flour together, and that ends up being about half a cup, so 25 grams each of those. And I mix it with an equal amount of water, which is a little less than half a cup. So this is like a quarter cup of water or so. And I mix it together in a jar. I just set it on a scale, tare it to 0, mix all of the ingredients together just like pancake batter. And then I cover it loosely with the lid as I was talking about earlier. And ideally, I'm staying in a warm location that's a little bit warmer than room temperature. So I know for some people, especially during the winter time, this isn't possible or it may be hard to get to that room temperature. But people do lots of things to kind of get to this Goldilocks zone, we call it. So this 75, 80-degree range, we call it the Goldilocks zone in sourdough baking. This is when your sourdough yeast perform best. And it's slightly warmer than room temperature. The yeast just really perform best you'll get a starter going a lot faster if you keep it warmer. So what some people will do is use some helpful tools that I have up here at the very end that I'll show, but some people will keep their starters on top of their a refrigerator where it's a little bit warmer and the ambient temperature is warmer. During the summertime, it tends to be warmer in our homes and a little more humid, so things tend to activate and go a little faster. Some people, I've even seen people on Facebook groups like crochet koozies for their starters to keep them warmer, or use like a plant germination mat or something like that to keep their starters warm. So there's lots of different things that you can do. But one thing I don't recommend doing is putting your starter in the oven with the light on. And that's because I've seen so many horror stories of people accidentally preheating their oven, and their husband comes down, and in the middle of the night, they go make some cookies, and their starter is in there, and it's a horror story, and then that starter is exploded in the oven, and it's like bye-bye 200-year-old starter from great grandma. So you don't want that to happen. So if you do put it in the oven with the light on to keep it warmer, just put a lot of flags on it or lots of signs or something, or lock the door so someone doesn't do that. So lots of ways to keep it slightly warmer than room temperature. Even if you're not, you can keep it at room temperature as well. But I let it rest for 24 hours, and I pretty much repeat this process every single day because we're starting the natural selection process of these sourdough yeasts are going to start to fight to kind of survive in this kind of incubator, essentially, is what you're making for it. And so by this next day, you probably won't have noticed any change in this activity. But I have to start discarding some of this, and that sounds a little bit wasteful, or it sounds like why would you do that? But by discarding it is actually doing, keeping the health and maintaining the health of the starter. Because if you don't discard any of this, suddenly you're feeding it more flour and water every single day, and it's going to quickly outgrow your jar, and you're going to have a monster sourdough starter, which no one needs a giant sourdough starter unless you're baking for a lot of people. So I discard about 2/3 of it. You don't have to, measure it or anything. You could do half, whatever works for you, but I discard most of the starter. And then I feed it, again, equal parts flour and water. And so that is helping to manage the size, and I repeat this every single day until the starter is close to being ready. By discarding, we're also reducing waste in this process as well, even though you're throwing some away and it seems counterintuitive, because if you leave more starter in your container, it needs to eat more and more flour and water. So if you leave a larger amount of starter in your jar, it will just kind of keep needing to be fed more and more. So by discarding it, we actually don't have to feed it as much flour and water. And that's why my recipe only uses, it's a small starter for that reason. And some recipes you'll see online will have you going through bags of flour just to get a sourdough starter started from scratch, which is completely unnecessary. And over the next few days, it's normal to see like a burst of activity. This is called like bacteria bloom. And this is just a natural selection process. So the yeast are kind of fighting to see who's going to survive this process. And through that, there may be some like kind of stinky smells in the process, especially if it's a little bit warmer. So it's normal for the starter to kind of smell bad over the next few days as you're making it. It can smell like sweaty gym socks or, acetone or nail polish remover. There's lots of different smells that go on through this process, but know that that's good, and that the yeast are kind of fighting to see who's going to survive, and eventually the good ones are going to win. That will leaven bread. But right now, you don't want to eat or consume any of this part of the discard when you're making a brand new one from scratch. So that's why over the next few days. But by day 6 for me, my starter was almost doubling in size overnight. I put this rubber band on it, so just as a visual to see where I fed it. And overnight, it rose all the way up to here, and then it fell back down. So I knew that it was getting really close to being ready, and that bad kind of stinky smell had gone away, and it started to smell more like yeast. So I knew that it was getting close to baking with, and that it was close to being ready. And after a week, my starter, every time I was feeding it, was consistently doubling in size in its container and falling back down in 24 hours. And so I could keep feeding it the exact same way that I've been doing, but I'll talk about how you can maintain or adjust its feedings. But I knew that it was ready now, and it was, had all these bubbles and gases in it, and it smelled yeasty and kind of nice. Lastly, you should name your starter for good luck. That's what most sourdough bakers do, and bakeries will often have their starters with some type of pun name. And I think it's because if you're personifying your starter and you're giving it a little bit of a name, it's a nice way to kind of know that if you don't feed Dolly Parton or Frodo Baggins, you'll feel bad. So it makes you feel a little more obligated to feed your starter. So people email me with the names of their starters afterwards. So you're taking some of mine, and then you can go home and feed it, and then give it a little name and a little label in your refrigerator or wherever you decide to store it. I include this slide because a lot of books or other people will kind of talk about this, or other blogs. So the float test is just a helpful but not always accurate way of telling if your starter is ready. It's helpful for beginners because your starter will double in size and then you can test it to see if it's ready to bake with. And essentially, you scoop off a part of your starter, put it into a glass jar with water, and if your starter floats, then that says your starter has enough carbon dioxide and gases in it that's less dense than the water. This is going to float to the top of the jar, and that means that it's ready to bake with. But once again, it's not always 100% accurate. The best way to know if your starter is ready is if it's consistently doubling in size after feeding it, if it smells yeasty and nice, and if it's full of bubbles, and maybe it even has like that slight acidic sour smell without it smelling like really stinky or anything. So that's the best way to know if your starter is ready, if it's consistently doubling in size and it's kind of full of those gases and bubbles. But this can be a helpful tool for beginners especially. And so a lot of people get their little starters and they're like, this is not enough to bake with, right? And that's true, it's not enough to bake with, but for most home bakers, this is all you need to maintain a small starter because there's less waste involved and you don't need a giant starter unless you're feeding an army or you have like 12 kids or something like that where you're going to be making a lot of food all the time. So for most people, a small jar of starter is all you need, and I typically keep my starter even in a small jar like this, and I'm baking and recipe testing every single day pretty much, and that's all I use to keep my starter in. And so every time I'm feeding my starter, I leave scrapes of starter in the jar, so about 5 grams or less. That's about the amount that's in this jar. You can literally just start with almost nothing in your jar, but there's enough there that will help inoculate when you feed it flour and water. There's enough there to inoculate that feeding process. And then I feed it equal parts flour and water. I wait for it to double in size, and it's bubbly, and then I repeat the process. And so this is what it looks like. Kind of here's a parabola, if you remember from math class. Part of the feeding process, just kind of a visual of like what it looks like. So you're going to feed your starter, it's hungry, so that just means that it's run out of food and it needs to be fed with more flour and water. So your starters right now are, at that part of the process, it needs to be fed, and then it will start to rise in its jar, and then it will hit this peak. So after, depending on how often or not you feed it, it could be, a few hours after feeding it, or it could be the next day even, and it will reach peak and stay there for a few hours at the most, and that also depends on a few different factors. But at this peak level, this is when it's bubbly, this is when it's doubled in size, it's eaten through all of its food, and it hasn't started falling back down yet. This is the ideal time that you're baking with it, this is the ideal time that you're gonna refeed it again, but it's pretty flexible in this process, but you just wanna make sure that it doubles in size, it hits its peak, before it starts going too far. So this graph would kind of go actually a little bit more down here. I should probably change that because the falling down process can take a little bit longer, but it essentially it's eaten through all of its food. There's no more energy for it at stake. It's kind of like our bodies, but if we go to the gym and you need energy and carbohydrates, if you don't feed yourself anything afterwards, you're going to be like starving, and your starter will start to starve during this process, and there'll be other byproducts of the fermentation, including alcohol, when it starts starving. And this gray liquid if you see a gray liquid of alcohol or this gray liquid kind of goo on top of your starter, that typically just means that your starter is really hungry, it needs to be fed a little bit more often, and that just means that your starter is starving. So if you ever see that, you can just pour it off. It's called the hooch, that's the term for that. And if you let your starter starve too long, so if it goes too long without feedings, we're talking multiple days, we're talking months in the refrigerator, it can even start to develop mold. It'll just get more and more acidic over time, more and more sour, and over time it'll just get weaker and weaker until it develops mold. And if you ever see anything pink or orange or anything like that in your starter, then it's mold, and you should toss it out because you don't want to bake with that or serve that to anyone. And every time I'm feeding my starter, I'm discarding some of it. And so discard can be a little bit of a confusing term because you don't actually have to discard it. There doesn't have to be any waste involved in the process. So I take my discard every time I'm feeding it, and I put it into a container, and then I keep it in the container in the refrigerator for up to a couple of weeks. And then I can use that without ever feeding it again in various recipes that are called sourdough discard recipes. Some people do throw away their discard, so they do actually discard their starter as they're feeding it. I don't recommend putting it down the drain. If you pour it down the drain, it dries up and it will clog your pipes, and you'll be calling a plumber very shortly. But you can compost it as well, or I have chickens, so you can dry it out and feed it as probiotics to your chickens as well, in a grain mash. So that's something that you can do with your starter. But anyways, your sourdough discard is just any portion of your starter that you're removing from its jar and you're putting it into another container, and then you're never feeding again. So if you are taking this home, this is my discard, but you're taking it home, you're going to feed it, so it's active sourdough starter. But when you take this home, if you decide I'm not going to feed this anymore, or I'm going to stick it in my refrigerator and never, bake with it, then it's sourdough discard, essentially. So, right, this is unfed sourdough starter, sourdough surplus. That's another kind of term for sourdough discard. So it's still sourdough starter. It's just the way that you use the sourdough starter. So it's part of the sourdough starter that you're removing from the mother kind of container that you're using to feed it. But you can use the sourdough discard recipes. I have a long list of these on my website, and I'm constantly adding more. I just made like a sourdough blueberry muffin recipe on there as well. So those are leavened quickly with baking powder and baking soda. And I use the sourdough starter in the way that you would use like sour cream, buttermilk, or yogurt in those recipes. So they interact with the baking soda because it's acidic. And you can use it in other things, like here's a good example of the Irish soda bread that was popular at St. Patrick's Day, of course. And so the baking soda is the quick-acting leavener, so this bread rises quite quickly in the oven, but the sourdough starter is in there not to ferment it, but really just as like a quick flavor enhancer. So this bread comes together in an hour versus a sourdough bread that ferments for maybe overnight in the refrigerator. So these are really great recipes to use your sourdough starter in a different way without having to have any waste during the feeding process. And I have instructions for you all on how to maintain and adjust the feedings for your starter, but I think it's important for you all to know how, or the different factors that affect the fermentation schedule and why you may need to decide to adjust how you're feeding your starter based on these different factors, because what works for me may not work for you based on these different environmental factors. And the number one thing that affects fermentation is temperature. So the ambient temperature I've already been talking about a little bit is going to be what affects fermentation the most and how fast or slow your starter is rising. So if you're wanting to control when it doubles or when it's in peak, if you control the fermentation process or the temperature process, then you can control the fermentation process. So if it's a little bit warmer, so during the summertime, if it's in that warmer environment, that Goldilocks zone, it's going to ferment faster. And if it's colder, so wintertime, or you live in a cold house like I do, then it's going to be slower. And so I have tools that I help to use to keep my starter a little bit warmer. The types of flours that you use to feed your starter also affect fermentation. So if you use whole wheats, whole grains, those are going to make it more vigorous. Sometimes I mill my own flour. I have some wheat berries up here. I have like a small home mill that you can like get online. And sometimes I mill my own wheat berries at home, which is great nutrition and flavor, but it also will make your starter a little bit more vigorous as well, just like the rye flour that I was using. So if you use whole wheats, it'll make it more vigorous. And then lastly, the ratio of ingredients that you leave in your jar affect how fast or slow your starter is going to rise. And so the way to think about this is that if you leave more sourdough starter in your jar, then it's going to rise faster. And if you leave less sourdough starter in your jar, then it's going to rise slower in proportion to how much you're feeding it. So if you feed it an equal ratio of starter, flour, and water, that's a 1-1-1 ratio, that will be ready in 4 to 5 hours in a warm environment. So you'll have a starter quite quickly going. It'll be ready to be fed or to bake with in that fast of a time. But if you follow the instructions that I gave you, that's a 1-6-6 ratio, so 5 grams of starter, that times 6 is 30 grams of flour and 30 grams of water. A 1-6-6 ratio will be ready in 12 plus hours, depending on temperature and these other factors that I talked about. So if you leave a small amount of starter in your jar and then you feed it a large ratio of flour and water in proportion to that, it takes a long time for that small amount of starter to eat through all of that food. But if you leave a large amount of starter in your jar and then you feed it equal amount of flour and water, that large amount of starter is going to eat through everything quite quickly because there's more seed culture in that, if that makes sense. And I have this small jar, and this is actually not really enough to bake with. This is a small sourdough starter, and most people aren't baking every single day, and that's why I like maintaining a small starter. But every time I go to bake, the day before, typically, I will take some of my starter from a jar and then put it into a larger jar and make one-time sourdough starter that is larger for my bakes. And this is called a levain. That's the French term for sourdough. But it's just another part of your sourdough starter that you're removing from the jar. So you could discard it, you could throw it away, you could give it to someone, you could save it for discarded recipes, you could put it in the trash, or you could put it into another jar and then feed it flour and water again and make a one-time sourdough starter, this levain, that you'll use one time for your bake. And so my recipes will start, the very first step will be like, make a levain, and it'll say, you need X amount of sourdough starter, X amount of flour and water, feed this, wait until it doubles in size, and then you will use it and mix into your doughs. So you'll mix your levain with your flour, water, salt, and this just for the breads. And so this is how I do my recipes, and a lot of other bakers use this as well. And that's one way of how I do my bakes. This is just an offshoot sourdough starter that you're making one time, but the main, one of the main benefits of making levains is that you can feed it different flours. So say if you wanted to bake a rye bread, you could take some of your starter, remove it from its container, and you still feed your starter the same way that you've been doing with bread flour or whatever flour you're using to feed it. But then this other starter that you wanted to use for your rye bread, you would feed it rye flour to make a rye levain for or rye starter, a rye offshoot starter, rye levain for your bread that you would mix into the dough. And so here's an example of a buckwheat levain that I made. I took some of my starter, and then I fed it buckwheat flour and water, and then I had this buckwheat levain that I used, and I put this into my buckwheat bread for that buckwheat bread recipe that's on my website. And another way of doing this is a little bit different. So I have the recipes with the levain, how I tell you exactly how to mix the levain, wait for it to double in size, and put it into your recipe. But some recipes will kind of skip this step, and they'll just say you need X amount of starter, and so you just need to know, I need to build my smaller starter up to a larger size. You can maintain a larger starter if you want to. You'll just have more waste or discard, or if you're baking with it all the time, you may not have any discard. You may just want to keep a larger amount of starter, like in a large jar like this. But for most people, I think a smaller jar works best. But these types of recipes, you'll just need to know that you need to build your starter to be large enough, and then scoop off however much you need for that starter. But you always need to have seed culture or some amount of starter, even as small as this, left in your jar to inoculate the culture. Because if you use it all in your baked product and you don't have any sourdough starter left, then you have to start all over again, which you don't want to do. So you always need that seed or sourdough starter culture there. And so this infographic I've put on Facebook and Pinterest and some other places, and it's also on my website and a couple of different places as well, but it just goes to the difference between these terms that I've been talking about, because sourdough starter, sourdough discard, and levain, they're all sourdough starter, but it's just the way that they're being used. So sourdough starter is the mother culture. It can last indefinitely if you feed it with regular care, and I typically feed it bread flour and water, and that's it. And then your sourdough discard is a portion of that mother culture that you're removing from the jar, and then I store it in like a deli container in the refrigerator for up to a couple of weeks, and every time I feed my starter, I just add on to it. So sourdough discard just kind of isn't ever fed again with flour and water, but you're just adding sourdough discard to it, and you can use it in non-leavened recipes like waffles, pancakes, or biscuits. And then a levain is an offshoot starter that you're making one time, so you're taking some of your mother culture from your sourdough starter, putting it into another jar, feeding it parts of flour and water, and then you can feed it different types of flours to affect the flavors of your breads. So the levain is, you're always baking with the levain. A starter, you're not necessarily baking with it. And so important for you all is to know how to store your starter, because I'm talking about feeding my starter every day. I leave it out at room temperature because I'm baking all the time, and so I leave my starter out, and I feed it every single morning, like after I brush my teeth or whatever. So it's just part of my daily routine, and if you bake a lot, then I would say that you should leave your starter out at room temperature and just feed it that way every single day. But for most people, and what most home bakers will do, is to slow down fermentation. They put it into the refrigerator because the refrigerator is cold, and we talked about how temperature affects fermentation. If you put it in the refrigerator, it will slow down the fermentation process, so you don't have to feed your starter at all while it's in the refrigerator, except for maybe once every 2-3 weeks, maybe up to a month at the most. And so you feed your starter, let it sit at room temp for an hour or two just to kind of get the yeast activated and going, and then you can put it in the refrigerator for up to a month at the longest, and set a reminder on your phone or whatever to then take your starter out, refeed it. You can put it back in the refrigerator, or you could take it out a couple of days before you want to bake with it, and get it back at room temperature to bake with. For longer term storage, I really recommend drying it out. You can freeze your starter. I just find it to be like a little bit more messy, and drying it out is really, really easy and simple to use. This is the way that I use backup starter. This is if you go on a really long vacation, so I'm talking about like if you're away for half of the year or something like that, if you have a timeshare or something, or if you want to gift your starter to someone, this is a really great way to do it. Mailing your starter, flying with your starter, this is the way that I do it. And like I said, I always have backup starter, and so I always have I always want a backup starter, so I always have dry starter on hand. And so to dry your sourdough starter, you wait until it doubles in size, and then when it's most activated and it's at that peak stage, then spread it thinly with a spatula on a piece of parchment paper on like a baking sheet or a silicone baking mat, and let it just air dry for 12, 24 hours. You may need to put like plastic wrap or something on it if there are like fruit flies or anything like that around, but otherwise, like during the winter time, I don't have to. I just let it air dry completely, and then you can let it break apart into these flakes and put it into like a storage container or like a jar like this at room temperature in the pantry, a cool, dark location for indefinitely. And your starter can last indefinitely this way. And if you buy starter online, it'll usually come dried like this. Sometimes it's ground up into a powder, so you can grind this up into a powder to reactivate it, and then mix that powder. It looks like flour again, but it'll just be like dried, fine dust of sourdough starter. Put it into a jar and to reactivate it with flour and water. Mix it together, and over the course of a couple of days or so, it can reactivate. And so that's the way to keep your starter indefinitely that way. And I had someone comment on my Facebook because I have a guide on exactly how to dry out your sourdough starter on my website, and someone commented, it was like, I had 10-year-old sourdough starter, and she had just done the process, and hers came back alive in like 2 days. So it's a really great way for long-term storage. And sometimes it takes up to a week to get activated, but that's a really great way to gift your starter, have backup starter, or go on vacation with it. But for most people, they usually keep their starter in the refrigerator. And so this is a visual guide of the instructions that you all have up here in the front. If you didn't get your starter at the beginning of the workshop, you can come up at the very end and get that. So this tells you exactly what to do with your starter when you get home. So if you have a jar, you have wheat flour at home, I would recommend go ahead and feed your starter tonight if you can. If you can't feed it tonight, and you just can't get to it, it will last in the refrigerator for 24 hours, maybe a little longer, but let's not risk it. It is hungry live culture. I fed it this morning, and so it traveled with Meal 90 all the way from Western Mass out to here. So I would really recommend feeding it tonight if you can. Feed it some whatever flour that you have at home. You don't have to go to the store right now and get bread flour. That's what it's been, kind of consuming, but you could feed all-purpose flour or whole wheat flour, whatever you have at home, and it will be okay, because this is live active culture and it's already healthy and happy for you to feed it, hopefully. So if you can, take it home, put it into a jar, and then feed it equal parts flour and water. It ends up being about 1/4 cup of flour, if you don't have a scale, and about 2 tablespoons of water. So that's 30 grams of flour, 30 grams of water. Put it into a little bit slightly larger jar. Mix it together like the images up here. Stir it together until the flour is completely hydrated like pancake batter. And then tomorrow it should be doubled in size. And then you can start the process of discarding it. So you can save that discard for recipes, put the discard on the refrigerator, or you can compost it or get rid of it, throw it away. And then repeat the same process again. And I would say do this for a couple of days, 2 or 3 days, maybe until like the weekend. And make sure that your starter's alive, that you know how to feed it, that you know how to maintain it and keep it healthy. And then decide you're going to store it in the refrigerator, dry it out if you're like, I don't know when I'm ever going to get to this seems too complicated or something. If anything like that, you can decide to store it for longer term storage that way, or you can find a recipe to bake with it as well. So find a recipe that you want to make on my website or somewhere else online, or maybe at a book here in the library that you can get to decide to bake with it. And so some helpful tools that I have up here, these are all our ways to control the temperature of your starter, because that's like the most important factor in fermentation and how fast or slow your starter is rising. And so I live in an old 1850s farmhouse up in the hills, and so my kitchen is really drafty during the winter time, and so I have to use these tools to keep my starter on a consistent schedule, so I know exactly how fast or slow it's going to rise when I put it in one of these containers, since I'm always baking with it all the time. And so I would recommend these for, as great gifts for people that are into sourdough baking, or if you know that you're going to be doing this like for a long time, or if you're like an intermediate baker and you're like interested in cool kitchen gadgets. So the first one that I have here is Goldie, which I'm definitely not going to pick up because I broke one of these one time. But you just plug it in. This is called, there's an image of it here. So this is Goldie by Sour House, and it's called Goldie because it keeps your starter in the perfect Goldilocks zone, that 75 to 80 degree temperature range. And I like to, it's just plug it into the wall. It's minimalist. It's really easy to use. Plug it into the wall, a little gold light will show up, and there's a little heating pad for your starter to rest on, and then you put the glass cloche right on top of your starter, and it's kind of like the Beauty and the Beast moment, with the rose, and you set your starter right on top of that. So that's a really great product to use that I use for my starter and Lavons. And then another one is the Broad and Taylor Sourdough Home. This is another kind of similar option as well, but it can also heat and cool your sourdough starter, so it's almost like a mini fridge for your starter. And so you can set the exact temperature that you want for this. and it has like a couple of drawers here, so you can have a couple starters in it or whatever, and set the exact temperature. Braun Taylor, they're based out in Western Mass in Williamstown, and so they make lots of different home devices for and kitchen gadgets for home bakers and various things, including for sourdough baking products. And another one that I use is their folding bread proofing box. So this is about yay big or so, a couple feet wide. Or like 3 feet wide maybe, but it's easy to fold up together, so it's not always out on your counter. You can set the exact temperature that you need, and I put my doughs in here when I'm proofing breads, cinnamon rolls, croissants, whatever I'm using, I put into this instead of putting it in the oven with the light on and accidentally, preheating my oven during that. And Braun Taylor helped sponsor the raffle tonight for this dough whisk that they made as well. So some recipes that I have on my website that I recommend kind of like most people try, especially for beginners if you're interested in sourdough baking. And I think these kind of encapsulate kind of like what the core sourdough baking process is like and give you kind of a unique perspective on some of the ways that I like to bake and things that I think, based on the hundreds of thousands of people that come to my website every month, that a lot of people find really popular and keep coming back to as like staples in their own households. And so the first two are 2 leavened recipes for your starter, so these have a long fermentation process. So the first one is this soft sourdough sandwich bread. It's like white sliced bread that you would buy at the store. So I was trying to kind of replicate that. It's made with whole milk and butter, but you can also make it plant-based as well, and you only need like a 9x5 bread loaf pan to bake that. So that one's really easy to come together. And then my everyday sourdough bread recipe is your like kind of typical sourdough bread recipe that you think of like San Francisco sourdough bread. That's the type of bread that you make with that. And then that recipe is very detailed and has lots of photos and instructions and like even videos on how I shape it and score it and other things to make that recipe. And then the next 2 are just 2 sourdough discard recipes that are really easy to make, come together quickly, that are like big bang for your buck, and the sourdough starter is acting as the flavor enhancer. So these sourdough discard chocolate chip cookies are quite popular. They have big pools of puddles of chocolate right in the middle, and then crispy little edges of around it with lots of flaky salt on top. And then the banana bread, I use chai spices in it just to like give it some interest, and I like kind of spiced breads. And it uses 5 mashed bananas, so that's a fun one if you have a lot of bananas around. But it's really easy because you just mix everything in one bowl together, put it into the bread loaf pan, and bake that up. And you don't need any special equipment for it. So if you have any questions, I can take those now. You can just raise your hand. My email is brandon@sourdoughbrandon.com, so easy to contact me, and you have my info there if you'd like to. Please follow along with social media at Sourdough Brandon. I'm on Instagram and Facebook. That's where I'm most active, and a lot of followers follow me, and they tag me in their bakes. So please, if you make one of my recipes or if you have questions, feel free to DM me or email me with any questions that you have. And I love getting comments and tags from people, especially from the workshops that attended that are using some of my starter to make the recipes at home. It's really great to see, especially local bakers and people in Massachusetts making these, because I have people from around the world making their recipes on the website, so it's really cool to see people here in Massachusetts using some of my own starter, because now the starter has been given out to like 1,100, 1,200 people across Massachusetts, so it's really exciting to like, we're all part of it, we're all connected by my own starter. If you want to look at it that way. And I have a newsletter sign up here. If you sign up at the front, then that's great, but this is also a QR code for that newsletter. It's a once a month newsletter, so I send an email once a month, so I'm not like spamming your email boxes, I promise. But it has like my new recipes for the month. Sometimes I have discounts or codes for some of these products or other things. And sometimes I have like tips and guides and like other kind of things that I have going on at home as well. So any questions that you all have before I do this raffle? Yeah.
One question someone asked me, they said you have to ask them, can you freeze it?
Yes.
You can freeze it.
You can freeze your sourdough starter if you want to freeze it. Some people will put it into like ice cube trays and then freeze it that way, or like other, they make shapes and things that you can sell, like molds. Or yeah, that's typically what people will do. You can put it in like a bag, a Ziploc bag. I find that the thawing out process just ends up being a little bit more tedious than it needs to be, because it thaws out and then you have like goo kind of, and it's sticky and it's a little more messy. So that's why I don't like to freeze it. I prefer to dry it out. But it is easy to freeze it if you would like to put your starter in like a container like that and put it in the freezer. And it can stay in the freezer like indefinitely. Yes, in the orange shirt.
Can the discard be dehydrated and then used over time?
Yes, so discard is just unfed sourdough starter. If you fed it flour and water again, it will come back to life. However, depending on the age of your sourdough discard, it will become more and more acidic over time, and it will start to weaken because it hasn't been fed. So essentially it's starved starter, and you're just letting it starve the longer and longer it is. So if you have fresh-ish sourdough discard in your refrigerator that's less than 2 weeks old, you can dry it out, and it will come back to life pretty decently. Or you could even bake with it and bring it back to life as a new sourdough starter or give it away to someone. But if your discard is a month old or longer, it may start getting that hooch layer of alcohol. You probably don't want to bake with it. It'll probably be really, really sour. It won't bake great bread, or it won't, if you dried it out, it just will take longer to activate because the cultures are kind of like starved and not really as active.
So typically, if I went home and put this in the fridge and tomorrow, or put it on the counter, and tomorrow I started feeding it,
Yes.
how long will it take before it's really ready to bake with, if I wanted to use it for like a bread?
Yeah, so if you took your starter home, say if you took it home tonight or you fed it tomorrow morning, you could bake with it, within a couple of days. You just need to build it large enough. The instructions that I have are for a small container like this, so that's not enough to bake with. But you would want to take when it doubled in size, and then take some of it, put it into a larger jar, and make a larger starter, or find a recipe like one of mine that has the Levant that tells you how to make it for a recipe. And so that you'll always have enough starter for like one of my recipes, because I always keep a small starter, and that's how I write my recipes. So in a couple of days, you could like bake bread with this over the weekend or something. Yes?
Earlier, I think you mentioned that you could cook bagels, bake bagels. And
Yes, I have a bagel recipe.
so I'm somewhat aware you have to have your dough, then you see it, that people will boil it, then it goes in the oven. So I'm curious about the boiling part.
Yeah, so to make bagels, you mix all your dough together. I typically have to use a stand mixer to mix it because it is a very stiff dough. And then when you mix your dough together, you'll let it proof for a while. Typically, I let it go overnight in the refrigerator, so there's lots of flavor, complexity, and also to just control the schedule of the baking. That's a great way to like put your dough in the refrigerator so it will rise slowly during that time. And then when you shape the dough into the bagels, you'll divide it all out, weigh everything out, shape it into the bagels, the rounds, and then you let them proof again. And then before baking, you boil them, because that's typically how bagels have their kind of chewy crust and texture. So you boil them in a pot. Typically, a lot of people use baking soda because that's what they have, and that pH change like helps give them that chewy crust. I will use barley malt syrup. That helps give it more of that flavor, the browning flavor that's like typical for especially New York City bagels that you'll find. And then you cook the bagels or top them. You can top them with everything seasoning or wherever you want to use, sesame seeds, poppy seeds, whatever, or just plain. And then you bake them in the oven. So the boiling process is kind of like when you're making pretzels or something as well. Helps give it that chewy outer texture to make bagels. Let's do the last question before I do this raffle.
Can you use the starter in the bread machine?
Yeah, so the question was if you could use your starter in the bread machine. So you can't use sourdough bread, or you can find sourdough bread recipes for bread machines online. Some people will just use the bread machine for the mixing process, and then they'll take their breads out and put it into another container to bake with. I don't personally have a bread machine, and you're not going to get the types of loaves like this that you associate with sourdough kind of baking with a bread machine, but you can make kind of more soft type of sandwich breads like this with a bread machine. I know King Arthur has sourdough bread machine recipes on their website, and some other people do as well. It's just not something that I personally have, so I don't have any. But you can do it. All right, so for the raffle, once again, this was sponsored by Broad & Taylor out in Western Mass. So thanks to them for sponsoring this. This is a dough whisk to help mix all your dough ingredients together where there's like less mess on your hands. So if you turn over your sourdough starter, I know someone already has it, so you don't have to run up here if you didn't get it. There should be a red star on the bottom if you won. Oh, okay, congratulations. All right. So thank you all so much for coming out tonight here in Burlington. If you didn't grab a starter, you can come up and grab it here at the end, or if you have other questions, feel free to come up and ask me or email me as well. Thank you.